Hey, good morning, Estella, Marianne, Bob, anybody else that is plugged in, and welcome to day number two of what we're going to do during this week and maybe all of Lent, I'm not sure. So today, what we're talking about this week is this idea that the idea we talked about on Sunday, that faith is a necessary component of love, and um, the fact that we don't go first, that faith and love are largely responses. And we want to talk this week just kind of little devotionals about this idea of responding. And I actually want to respond to a question that somebody asked me on Sunday. It was a really good question, and the question was, what about people that I do not trust? I still love them, I just don't trust them. Good morning, Ann. And there may be good reasons that they don't trust this person. The person has broken trust numerous times, repeatedly over the course of a lifetime. So that person is not to be trusted. But the person who was talking to me said, however, I still love that person. And his whole question was, if we don't trust, then is faith not part of a loving relationship? First of all, I said to this person on Sunday, I said, yeah, it's interesting that thought didn't make the final cut in my sermon on Sunday. Actually, I shouldn't even say final cut. That was kind of out pretty early. But I had thought about that idea that, if I was communicating that faith is a necessary part of love, then what about people that we don't trust? Does that mean that we don't love them, or am I wrong about this concept? So the short answer is no, that faith is always necessarily a component of love. And so for the next 2 days, we're going to talk about a really important concept when it comes to God and loving God and how to do that. And both of them have to do with faith. The first component that we're going to talk about today is the idea of broken faith. And then the other one we're going to talk about tomorrow, the idea of doubt. Really, really important concepts. So the easy answer is that when somebody breaks trust with us, faith is still a component, but it's broken faith, and it obviously changes your relationship. But faith is still there. You simply cannot love without faith in one way or another being part of a relationship. And if you have maybe unfortunately had somebody break faith with you, do something that causes you to not trust that person anymore, and you still love them, you know that faith is still present, but it's kind of broken. And if you're going to restore that faith, then there's going to be a lot of work. If you're going to be healed from that, then there's going to have to be confession on the part of the person that broke faith. Maybe you're the person, in fact, maybe you did something that broke trust with somebody, and the work that's necessary to rebuild that faith is there has to be confession, there has to be there has to be forgiveness, and there has to be some work in restoring that relationship. And all that is part of love, because faith is necessarily a part of love. On the other hand, there are sometimes people who don't want to do the work of rebuilding trust. Either that, or they've proven to you that they are not trustworthy people. And in that case, usually we love, but we love with boundaries. And we might maintain a relationship, but there are certainly going to be certain boundaries that you're going to have in order to continue to love that person. So the truth is that faith is always there. Faith is always a component in all of our relationship, even if it's broken faith, or what we're going to talk about tomorrow, even if it's faith that comes mixed up with a whole lot of doubt. But it is always there. You simply cannot remove faith from love and still have love. Faith is simply a necessary component of our relationships. So the truth about faith is that it is not, and trust in a relationship, it's not just a yes/no thing. Do we have it or not? Faith it exists really kind of, think of it as kind of a continuum. Faith exists on a continuum, and it's not just black and white. I have it or I don't. Good morning, Keisha. Um, but it exists much more on kind of a continuum. Let's take, for example, the person that I talked about in the message on Sunday. Um, that young man, not young, I keep calling him young, but that guy in my extended family that I'm not as close to him now, but was close to for a while and was working with. Um, and he had struggled with relationships, wanted to be married, wanted to be in a relationship, and was not for a lot of years, despite a whole lot of effort on his point to try to find a spouse. And eventually he did. And I think if you remember on Sunday, if you were plugged in on Sunday, I talked about the fact that he eventually called and said, "Hey, I finally did it. I finally told a woman that I loved her." And his expression, if you remember on Sunday, his expression was, "Is it safe to say I love you?" And it's a wonderful expression because it just communicates the idea that love comes with a whole lot of risk. Um, when we hand somebody our hearts, we're essentially giving our hearts to that person, giving our lives to that person, and there's a whole lot of risk. And when when any of us discover that love is returned, that leads to a kind of euphoria that we often call falling in love. And that falling in love is that experience of discovering that your love for a person is returned. And there's all kinds of jokes and all kinds of wonderful movies and all that kind of stuff about what it's like to fall in love. And that euphoria comes from the fact that you have taken a risk and the risk is returned. It's a wonderful experience, and it leads to all kinds of goofy things that we do as human beings, um, simply because of the risk involved. That's simply part of that euphoric feeling. There's risk, and the risk turns out to be well placed, and it's returned. But think about again this continuum. After a certain period of time in our relationships, that euphoria kind of settles down. It doesn't last 20 years. It doesn't last 40 years. Um, and we don't feel that euphoric feeling that we used to feel when we, quote, fell in love. And the reason we don't is because the risk is diminished. After 20 years, after 40 years, you know the person, and you know that person can be trusted, and the risk is lessened, so the euphoria is lessened. But that does not mean that you don't love any less just because you don't feel the euphoria. In fact, the truth is that after 20 years and 40 years, your love is certainly, I would say it's deeper than it was when it first started. And it's deeper in part because you found out that you can trust the person. So, so yes, you can love even when we no longer trust a person. So think for a minute about what happens now. So obviously, if this idea that if it's true that one of the reasons we feel this euphoric feeling when we fall in love is because we've taken a risk, the risk is returned. Faith exists on a kind of continuum. It settles down after a while. Think for a minute now about what we're kind of talking about, the theme. What happens when faith is broken? What happens when somebody does something, or maybe it was even you, does something when trust is broken? In the same way that we feel euphoric when we find out that our love is returned, when trust is broken, it's equally shattering to people. When somebody discovers, and I've worked with people who've had this happen, when somebody discovers that you have been cheated on, for example, it is shattering. It's the flip side of the euphoric feeling, because all of a sudden that trust, you found out that trust was, maybe you would say, it's been misplaced. And you suddenly discover you no longer can trust that person. That does not mean that you don't love that person, but certainly your love has changed. And there's going to have to be effort in order to rebuild the trust. So what do we do? What do we do? So I want to shift and think about our relationship with God for a moment now, because that's ultimately what we're talking about. Obviously, we use people as an example. The fact that um, we can still love even when we don't trust, but it just changes the nature of our love. So think about God, because that's obviously what we've been working on, the idea that we want to discover how to love God. And I tried to say it starts with faith. Faith has to be a component. You want to think about how this works with God, this idea of broken trust. So there's and what we have to do about it. Jesus told a story about broken trust. It's, I think, probably one of his most well-known stories, the story of the prodigal son. The story of the prodigal son is really a story about a father with two boys. There are two sons, not just one. In fact, that's the very first line of the story that Jesus says. There's a man that had two sons, so both sons have a part to play. And obviously, if you go to that story in Luke chapter 15, and I would suggest that when you get a chance today, sometime you read it. In Luke chapter 15, when Jesus says there's a man that has two sons, obviously when you read the story, the man, the father, is kind of a stand-in for God, and the sons are us. He's telling this story to people who are a little bit frustrated with Jesus, and they're asking Jesus, why do you hang out with the people you hang out with? Because it turns out that the people that were most drawn to Jesus were people who you could say had broken trust with God, people who in one way or another were very distant from God, but they were drawn to Jesus. So Jesus tells this story, but it turns out when you read through the story that both of those sons are very distant from God. You have obviously the one, the prodigal, who in essence said, Dad, I don't really care if you live or you die. I want your money. And I want to get out of here. And the father, in this tremendous act of grace, gave his wealth, divided his wealth, and gave what belonged to the youngest son. And he ran off, and, Jesus had just engaged in wild living. That's obviously broken trust. But it turns out there's a second son, and the second son was equally lost to the father. He was the good son, and he was out back in the fields working hard. And in the story, he says a remarkable thing. When the younger son comes home and dad throws a party, the older son says, I have been slaving away all these years for you. And it's very clear that what Jesus was communicating there was, here's a son who obviously in a different way had kind of broken trust in the fact that he was the good son, but he did not love the father. He saw himself as a slave. And here's the thing about that story, and this is why this is so important, especially because of this idea that we don't go first, that God goes first. When Jesus tells that story, he makes it clear that the father goes out for both sons. The younger son decides, you know what, at least if I worked for my dad, I could eat. So he starts home. And Jesus tells a story that says, while that son was still a long way off, the father saw him. Clearly, he was waiting for the son to come home, and he ran out to him. And then when the older brother starts to head home, just like the younger son, he starts to head home, and he hears that there's a party at home, and he gets upset, and he asks, why is there a party? And he finds out your brother who was dead is alive again. He was lost, and he's on his way home, and he gets ballistically angry. And Jesus said the father went out for him too. So the dad goes looking for both sons. God goes first. So I'd suggest two things for you if we're going to be learning this idea of responding, that God goes first, and that faith is a response that happens to us. Read that story sometime today from Luke chapter 15, and simply ask, which of the two sons are you? I think all of us have a tendency to be one of those sons, which is why Jesus told the story. We have a tendency to be either the son who says, Dad, screw you. I don't care. I want to be out of here. Or we have the son who's the good son, who works hard, who's really not in a relationship with God, but he sees himself as slaving away for the Father. So I'd simply ask, which of those are you? What's your tendency? And then spend, whatever time you want to spend, um, whatever time you have to spend, just thanking God that the Father, that He goes out looking for both sons. If you're the lost one, God's out looking for you, wanting you to come home. And if you are the son who stayed at home but is equally lost, God also goes out looking for you. And love and faith comes to us as a response to a God who goes looking. So today, just this idea that broken faith is not a lack of faith. It simply changes the dynamics of how we love. Tomorrow we're going to talk about doubt, especially doubt in our relationship with God. What does that look like? But for today, just focus on this idea that broken faith is not the absence. Faith is still there. It just changes the dynamic of how we love. And the Father will go looking. So let me say a prayer again for us, and then we can get on with our days. God, thank you for the fact that Jesus knew us so well, and He told a story about a father who loves and a father who went out looking for both of his sons, both of whom had broken faith. One had engaged in what Jesus called wild living, and one stayed at home, but was equally distant from the Father. Thank you, God, that you are a God that comes looking for us, a God that goes out to meet both of us. You do that all the time. You've done it for me, and you do it for all of us. God, I pray that we would be learning this week to respond to you and respond to your love for us. I pray that you'll do that for us today. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty, everybody. Well, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. Everybody enjoy the warm weather. Hope you guys get out at some point and enjoy the day. Love you all. Goodbye.